Hi, this is Paul. I want to talk about The Batman. Now, Saturday night, I saw The Batman at my local theater. Um, oh, there's no way to get this sentence right. My son's girlfriend, that's the best way to do it, because I've got three sons, and two of them have girlfriends. And so I was going to say one of my son's girlfriends, but that could put either of my sons in jeopardy. So I'll just say my son's girlfriend very much wanted to see it, and one of my daughters wanted to see it. And so my son and my wife and I and his girlfriend and my daughter all went out to the local theater to watch The Batman. Now, I didn't know almost anything about this movie. I'd seen the Critical Drinker review of it, which was sort of mediocre. Just pulling up the Rotten Tomatoes ratings, 85%, 88% audience, so quite high for Rotten Tomatoes, quite favorable. And I want to talk about this movie. Now, why talk about a superhero movie? Why talk about a movie at all? And we're going to do more talking about superheroes that, based on my past videos, probably not too many more people, but beyond Paul and Leitner will be excited about this, because some of you just roll your eyes at these superhero movies. But I do think that they say something about who we are and where we are and sort of our religious state of the union. Now, one of the videos that never made the cut in terms of my Consciousness Congress was a little bit of commentary on the Critical Drinkers' unsurprisingly disapproval of Ms. Marvel. That apparently this is one of these shows on Disney Plus where Disney is trying to not lose all the momentum from Infinity Wars, and didn't particularly catch my interest except for the little clip, the little moment where you notice that Miss Marvel is Muslim. And what's interesting to me about that is, of course, well, what is the connection between religion and these fantasies / mythology surrounding superheroes? And I would imagine that when it comes to Walt Disney, this is just sort of an attempt at inclusion. See, Muslim children can be indoctrinated by the cult of Disney just like everyone else can, which was, in fact, I think, part of the Al-Qaeda and the overall resistance against Americanism by Islamism. So her Islamic aspect, let's say, is not an incidental part of the story, because what in essence Disney is saying is that everybody can have a religion just like everyone can have a favorite color. And it's about that consequential in terms of this young woman's real life aspirations, which is, of course, power and exaltation and glory. So when I search on YouTube, which has become my most favorite search engine over the last 4 years, when I search on YouTube for Batman reviews, and I'm going to include spoilers, which this video will include, so if you haven't seen the movie and you don't want anything spoiled, go elsewhere. You've been warned. And if you drop into the video later than this, which nobody in their life does, because I don't put little nice user-friendly bookmarks in, well, then you're just strange. So the first movie that comes up is Chris Stuckman's movie review of Batman, and he loves it. And a little ways down, Ben Shapiro's spoiler-laden movie review of Batman is in, and he hates it. And I thought a lot about how do I want to do a movie review on my channel, because, you know, the way that YouTube tends to do it, and it's very good, is you have stills and scenes, and you keep it down to a minimum, and that way you can sort of do a full-blown YouTube movie review. But this is a Monday morning, and I had a full day yesterday, and I am not going to sit here and edit video and grab little snips of YouTube and put this all together. You can get that from other far better reviewers with far more time to do reviews properly. I'm going to do this the way I'm going to do it, and I'm going to start with Ben Shapiro, because actually both reviews, both a negative review and a positive review, bring out some important things, and then I want to add some more context and some more reflection on it from, obviously, a religious perspective. So first, I'll give you the spoiler alert on the spoiler alert of Ben Shapiro's, his take, which he puts right at the front of the beginning, right at the front of the review.
And then I got a little further in. I was like, all right. And then I got to the end. I was like, meh. And then the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. And so you're about to hear a lot of hot takes on the Batman because I hate this movie. Okay.
Lots of hot takes on the Batman from Ben Shapiro. I hate this movie. Now, first of all, I want to get into what do we mean by when we say we like or we hate a movie? Do we like or hate the point that we interpret the movie as making? Do we sort of evaluate ourselves as whether or not we had the kind of movie experience that met expectations? I left the theater thinking, I have a lot to think about because of this movie, therefore I liked it. My wife didn't like it so much. My son's girlfriend, well, it had one of her favorite actors in it, so she loved it. My son, of course, had wry, droll things to say about it to just pester his girlfriend. And my daughter and my wife sort of left a little bit creeped out about it. Didn't help the fact that we just hung out outside the movie theater for a little while we were deciding what we were going to do after the film. And there were a whole bunch of police cars and there were a whole bunch of youth just milling about. And obviously the police cars and the youth were there for the same reason. And that was the night that at 2 a.m. when the nightclubs let out, there was what is now in your news feed about Sacramento, a mass shooting, which will obviously cause the city to do a lot more soul searching, not unlike the kinds of soul searching that goes on in this movie with respect to Gotham City. And again, these movies now, especially after watching the Joe Rogan, Michael Schellenberger conversations about cities and violence and murder, well, it seems it's the 1970s all over again. So let's begin with Ben Shapiro's review.
Okay, first of all, I'm just going to tell you right up front, spoilers. Spoilers aplenty here. So if you haven't seen the film yet and you want to see the film and you don't want to be spoiled, I'm warning you. You've been warned. All right, this is
There's that.
Detective Batman. So if the original Michael Keaton Batman was sort of crime-fighting Batman and the Christopher Nolan Batman was city-saving Batman, this Batman is supposed to be Detective Batman. And this has a long...
And now that's important, too, because part of what I thought of immediately when the movie opens, and I'll get into this more in the Chris Stuckman review, is there's a question of, Jordan Peterson would say, level of analysis. My ongoing conversation with Oscar via the Friday question and answer, question of being. And Oscar, I felt a little bad because I thought I might have been a little sharp with you on Friday. Maybe expressed a little bit of annoyance, but not really annoyed. This is the questions you're asking about levels of being is actually a very big and important question. Because consciousness is monofocal, we are always looking for some level of analysis by which we can arrive at the truth, let's say. And, if you read Jordan Peterson, 12 Rules for Life, you'll notice that being, capital B, or sometimes all caps being, post Heidegger, is once again sort of a level of analysis that we are all trying to frame and therefore work from. And that is within this whole comic book genre, as I'm going to get into in a couple of other videos that I played the last time that I did any kind of in-depth treatment on superheroes. Yeah, this is going to be a long video. And I know for Jacob, who lamented on the live stream the shortness of many of my recent videos, Jacob, your prayers have been answered. I think this is going to be long. This is going to be, 2 to 3 hours, if not longer. So, well, let's keep going with this. So this is Detective Batman. And I like the fact that we've got some self-consciousness around the different Batmans. There's also, obviously, with movies, there's a tremendous, the palette is, the canvas is enormous. And the last best Batman movies, the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, you have, I think Shapiro does a good job in sort of critiquing some of this, but you have sort of blue sky techno Batman, stars are out at night, and he's got big guns and big tech, and he's going to do a big job against big criminals. What I liked about this Batman, again, was that it was, yes, the movie was too long. When we all emerged from the movie theater, many of the people were like, oh, that was 3 hours. And as Ben Shapiro said, it felt like 7. It did seem to sort of drag. But while I was watching myself watching the movie, I thought, I'm glad that the pacing is slow. I mentioned a few days ago that if you watch movies on, let's say, HBO Max, you can find a whole bunch of older movies from the 70s. Pacing is different. So let's keep going with Shapiro's review.
History in the Batman comics. Some of the best Batman comics, particularly my favorite, The Long Halloween, is rooted in the idea of Batman not just as Caped Crusader, but as a great detective. Smart.
Now, let's talk a little bit about Ben Shapiro's canvas here. Reds and blacks. Just saying, his set is pretty dark. It's not black and white, it's black and red. And there's something about Ben Shapiro's show that is very much black and red. Those are the two options.
Smarter than everybody else, capable of picking up on clues, investigating and tracking down crimes. I'm going to start with what's right with the film because it's going to be real short. So what's right with the film is that it looks great. It is a film noirish take on Gotham City. It almost feels kind of like retro Taxi Driver Gotham City. So everything is very dirty. It's all taking place at night. It's shot in kind of grayscale at times. It's got a lot of warm oranges and reds, but against a very dark black. So it's a lot of muttered dialogue. It feels as though it's taking place in the same city as Joker is taking place. So if you saw Joker, Todd Phillips' Joker, which looks like 1970s New York, it feels almost like the other half of that, but it seems more like the take on what future New York would look like if you were living in New York in 1970. That's
bingo. I think Shapiro got it exactly right. And I made comments back when Joker came out that it was, singing my song with his words and looking at, if New York was gritty and dysfunctional, Patterson was more so. And New York has been yuppified since Friends and Sex and the City and all of that. And Patterson has never been. So Patterson continues to be dark. And that's why Patterson and some of the cities at least far enough away from New York to express all the downsides of higher property values and none of the upsides of actually remaking any of it. So of course the Joker was filmed in a little section of Newark, which has not undergone the transformation that happened under Giuliani and the renovation of urban downtowns in the late 20th, early 21st century. Given the shooting in Sacramento, one of the interesting things that the mayor of Sacramento kept talking about was downtown is still safe. Downtown is still safe. It's like he's got post-traumatic stress disorder from the 1970s, as many of us do.
So that's sort of a good way of putting it. The music to the film is okay. He is nothing. Her performance. You have John Turturro.
And the movies and the performance, all fine. I didn't know that the Penguin was Colin Farrell at all. And so, yeah, I agree with Shapiro. Wow. Best performance. So let's get a little further in Shapiro's review. And I think with respect to the wokeness, Shapiro gets it right. And Shapiro being an anti-woke warrior to a degree.
Batman. Like the actual Batman character hates the Batman character. And this drives me up an absolute wall.
Now, if you just hear that, you really don't need to see any more of his review, but we should dig a little deeper as to why he says the movie hates the Batman character. Because I think this gets into what I think is the importance of the movie now. Because before the Ukrainian war, I would say that what we're thinking about is, well, we have to burn society down in order to rebuild better, to build back better, to have the Great Reset. And the only way is to dismantle capitalism and the patriarchy and all of these things. And if we tear it down to the ground, then we can build it up better. Now that we're watching the Ukraine get burnt to cinders and ashes, we're wondering, do we have to take it all the way down to the ground? Do we have to really burn it down? And again, it's fascinating to watch the fact that in the wake of George Floyd, it was, well, we should defund the police. Well, I'll tell you right now in Sacramento, nobody anywhere on the spectrum is talking about defunding police. They want more police. And if you listen to the Joe Rogan Schellenberger conversation, in many of the West Coast cities that where the police departments have experienced a drop in morale because of everything that happened during the George Floyd aftermath, those cities that are having a difficult time recruiting police are having a difficult time policing, which should come as a surprise to no one.
The biggest problem with the film is not the wokeness. Yes, there's some woke touches. You have Catwoman, who is a woman of color, who is, of course, good. And you have the black female mayor, who is good. And you have the black Jim Gordon, who is good. Every white character is apparently bad, like all of them. Fine, whatever. I don't really care about that. That's fine. You have Catwoman.
And now the wokeness is a part of, I think, the message of the film, because I think what the film is actually doing in a lot of ways is deconstructing wokeness. And it's deconstructing wokeness with the hope of, on one hand, maybe they'll be building back better, but at the end of the movie, they sort of leave the world in the static dysfunction of Gotham. And we'll get into that in a minute.
Say stuff about white privileged elites, and she makes a suggestion that Bruce Wayne as a child, when his parents were killed, he doesn't really have a right to be super upset about that because, of course, he was very, very rich.
And the Riddler goes on towards the end of the movie. The Riddler goes on about that with respect to Bruce Wayne, because as it turns out, okay, here's a big spoiler. The Riddler was also an orphan funded by the Wayne Foundation, but the kind of orphan that Bruce Wayne was not the same kind of orphan that the Riddler was. And so there's a lot in this movie comparing the Riddler to Batman, and there is a narrative arc, a transformation narrative arc with respect to Batman that is clear in the movie. And in many respects, the movie invites people to sort of look at racial differences, white privilege versus sort of the white man's burden, which comes through sort of with the Bruce Wayne character and the Batman character, and also these narratives of wealth privilege. And the movie almost ends as I can pull it up. Through the miracle of the internet, a number of years ago, David Brooks triggered something about the wasps. Now, what do I mean by the wasps? Do I mean the insects? No. Those of you following the channel and haven't just jumped in here because the algorithm put you on the trail of this video because it's yet another Batman review and there are links to Ben Shapiro and to Chris Stuckman, and the algorithm thought that was interesting, so they brought you here. No, we're having a long-term conversation about the roots of the implicit American religion, which is established Protestantism, which sort of went non-sectarian after the Second World War. And by 2010, David Brooks was sort of saying, boy, that waspy thing wasn't too bad when we had FDR, who was sort of the inclusive, mainline, elite Protestant, welcoming the Jews and the Catholics into his administration. And, well, now after the financial downturn of 2008, when people sort of let the mortgage industry get real slippery, maybe we need the wasps to come back. And of course, many other people came around and said, no, we don't need the wasps back. And there's a problem with capitalism and meritocracy. What we really need is just empathy embodied and absolutely the only emotion that's left standing. Well, of course, usher in Jordan Peterson, Rebel Wisdom, and everyone else to say, well, don't forget, you do have a shadow, and you had better not deny it, because if you deny your shadow, it'll come leaking out in all sorts of ways. What you had better do is integrate your shadow so that you can be both strong, dangerous, and merciful. Okay? That's sort of the element around that. Back to Ben Shapiro.
That kind of rings hollow. A lot of these lines seem like throwaways for film lefty Twitter, but the main theme is not a throwaway. The main theme is what matters here. The film despises Batman.
Now, the main theme is not that the film despises Batman. Does the film despise Batman, and what on earth does Ben Shapiro mean by that? The film does not agree with Ben Shapiro's take on Batman. The film is a theological conversation with respect to the things that go into making Batman who he is, and so the filmmakers, unsurprisingly, have a great difference of opinion with Ben Shapiro. People have differences. It's okay. The interesting thing is, what are the differences and where are they going, and can we evaluate them? So let's let Ben talk a little more.
So every Batman iteration has to explain why a man who is a billionaire would dress up like a bat and go around beating up criminals. It's not
okay, right there. And it's a great question. And it's, in fact, the kinds of tension that makes Batman interesting. It makes him archetypal. Bruce Wayne is almost a Jesus figure, is the wealthiest man in the world. He came from heaven above to show the way. Now, he's a bat. He flies. But he is not a creature of the day, Gospel of John. Those of you who have been walking through us in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John does a lot of things with night and day. He is a creature of the night who comes from heaven. So there's already a lot of tension in there. Now, it's so interesting that Ben Shapiro says, well, let's have him say it again through the miracle of YouTube.
Is what matters here. The film despises Batman. So every Batman iteration has to explain why a man who is a billionaire would dress up like a bat and go around beating up criminals. It's not
okay. Go around beating up criminals. Is that what Batman does? Well, he certainly beats up criminals. But is that the heart of who Batman is? Batman wants to save the city. And the question is, what is the city? So, beating up criminals. The movie opens with all of this street crime. Okay. All of this street crime. And the image is people are getting away with it. The police can't stop it. Again, triggering the 1970s once again. Kitty Genovese. Well, this is actually a very big thing in comic book stories. So a great video on YouTube is Watchmen Explained, and I'm not planning on playing through the whole thing, but it's really helpful to understand the development of the comic book genre and the development of the national zeitgeist. Let's talk a little bit about Rorschach and Batman, because actually there's some Batman and Superman all throughout the Watchmen characters. Let's start at the beginning here.
Is mysteriously killed. The murders investigated by Rorschach, a hero who refused to retire. On the surface, Rorschach is like Batman. He lurks in the shadows, beats up criminals, says edgy shit in a gravelly voice, but by
Rorschach doesn't have wings. Batman always comes from above. Rorschach comes from below.
By day, Batman is Bruce Wayne, a sexy genius billionaire, while Rorschach is Walter Kovacs, a greasy loner weirdo who walks the streets with a sign that says the end is nigh.
Now, isn't Ben Shapiro a little bit of both?
Because realistically, the sort of person who dresses up and fights people at night isn't a functional person. He's a nutcase. So Rorschach is an asocial, violent psycho with an extreme worldview. He thinks all of society is filthy and sinful and doesn't deserve mercy.
Almost sounds like a Calvinist.
Rorschach's black and white mask reflects his black and white morality. Everything's either good or evil, and evil must be punished. He says he never compromises in his judgment, but he's often biased. He spares people punishment.
And of course, most of us have known people who are like Rorschach in this, that they never compromise, but then we watch them compromise all over the place.
For personal reasons. And like when he hears the comedian tried to rape Silk Spectre, he doesn't care, because he sees the comedian as a patriot and Silk Spectre as a whore.
Okay, now right here, we have to do a little bit of comparing about archetypes, because another one of the tensions, I think the Batman movie is a deconstruction of wokeness. And it basically finds that the woke answers are insufficient. Now, part of the difficulty of pervasive bulverism is that you can absolutely dismiss anything, including the deconstruction of wokeness, by saying, oh, that's because Hollywood producers are rich white men, and they're just trying to preserve their position. Okay, if you can just continue to reduce people down to one simplistic motivation that you project on them, fair enough. But there are all of these tensions, and one of the tensions that we are currently trapped in by virtue of Stalin's statement about one person is a tragedy, a million people is a statistic, is in fact and wait for it, Luke, the advent of personalism. Personalism? What is personalism? Well, pragmatically, personalism boils down to you might stand against everything that person is doing, but when you're face to face with them, you're going to treat them as a human being. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Sometimes it's a good thing. Sometimes it's a bad thing. And so Rorschach doesn't break up the rape, even though, of course, rape is wrong. But hey, these people are not people in front of him. They are archetypes. And so he treats them as archetypes, and seeing them as archetypes rather than as complex human beings basically means that he self-justifies the kinds of things that he self-justifies.
Yeah, reasons. And like when he hears the comedian tried to rape Silk Spectre, he doesn't care, because he sees the comedian as a patriot and Silk Spectre as a whore.
Therefore, let it go.
Rorschach is psychologically disturbed by sex. As a kid, his mother was abusive, and he saw her working as a prostitute. Sexuality reminds Rorschach of...
And now this, of course, is post-psychology, so now Rorschach, he's a monster. Well, Rorschach, he's a human being. The conflict between archetypal thinking and personal thinking. How do we interact with other people? Are they manifestations of a spirit? Or are they individuals trapped within the war of the spirits, and that there's something down in that person that is deserving of mercy and even respect, even though their grip within the archetypal spiritual forces is nearly overwhelming?
His hatred and disgust for his mother, and he expresses this anger by fighting criminals. Rorschach became a vigilante when he heard about Kitty Genovese, a real-world murder victim in the 60s.
Now, if you're unfamiliar with this case, I heard about this case again and again and again growing up, because what the Kitty Genovese case sort of did was reshape America with Calvinist lenses after it had convinced itself that, oh, people are basically good. And so here within this, you have the conflict between these parts of Western Christianity. You've got the strong Augustinianism, which is a little bit sober about human nature. And then you've got this optimism that human beings can remake the world by creating institutions and governments and all of these things to finally give us what we want and what we need. And here's a woman who is brutally attacked and crying out in the street, and nobody lifts a finger to help her.
Rorschach was still a kind of rational person back then, until he discovered the savage murder of a child. Rorschach saw the darkest side of humanity, and it broke him, convinced him that the world is random and godless.
Did you notice the color palette of this comic panel is exactly the color palette of Ben Shapiro's Ben Shapiro's review of The Dark Knight?
And has no meaning.
I'm sorry, The Batman.
Save what we choose to impose. The only way Rorschach could save himself from despair and trauma was to impose his brutal ideology, punishing evil no matter the cost, which often...
Now, I don't know if Jonathan Peugeot has released this yet, but I've watched exactly one of Jonathan Peugeot's Patreon videos, even though I've been a Patreon of his for a long time, just simply because I want to support him. But he had a good one now, and again, this is Jonathan Peugeot talking about what the authoritarian rise to address chaos after the, I'll rephrase it a little bit from what he does, the feeling of helplessness and the exposing of impotence that the coronavirus did to us. Suddenly, we feel insufficient to handle the dramatic challenges that the world has to offer. At the end of the Batman movie, the Batman is sort of resigns himself to never really, well, can Gotham be cleaned up? That question sort of hangs over the air. You're going to have a new black mayor, and you're going to have black Commissioner Gordon running the police. So African Americans, especially black women, are almost always seen as these saintly, godlike, moral paragon figures. Now, it's not incidental, of course, that one of the members of the Trinity in the shack is an African American woman. So you've got all of these themes rolling through this, but the Batman movie doesn't really end that, well, this new black mayor, well, will that new black mayor, well, maybe she's not a lesbian like the mayor of Chicago, and has electing a lesbian black mayor of Chicago suddenly made Chicago the center of glory on the earth. So what you see happening is, well, wokeism has never been tried. Well, have our small forays into wokeism actually achieved the results?
Just causes more suffering. Like, he routinely gets information by breaking random people's fingers until he hears something useful. He terrorizes a sick old man, and he breaks into people's houses and eats all their beans. Rorschach...
I love it that he eats their beans. It's like, he's just gassy.
Calls everyone else parasites, but he's the one who lives off other people. Rorschach calls everyone filth, but he's the one who stinks. He says he never compromises, but he often does, and his obsession with punishing evil just leaves more bloody footprints behind him.
Now, this is a tension that is in the Batman movies, and it was in the Christopher Nolan movies too, because at some point, the Batman just keeps killing and beating up, and sort of like Captain, sort of like Mr. Incredible from The Incredibles, I just cleaned up this place. Why can't you people keep it clean? And, well, you know, an eye for an eye, as Gandhi said, leaves men blind. How on earth can the world be cleaned up? And this is where the religion of Ms. Marvel, which is sort of something like a favorite color, or the questions about vengeance and violence in Batman, can in fact the city be cleaned up if you've got someone lurking in the shadows who's beating up petty criminals like the person who attacked Kitty Genovese? Will that in fact clean up the city? And this is a very live conversation, because of course New York got cleaned up partly, some suggest, but of course it's contended, just about like everything else, with the broken windows policy under Rudy Giuliani. Well, did in fact, paying attention to the small things sort of lift the spirits of the city? Or were there other waves that were going through, and the one salient thing that we could point to is the broken windows policy, and that was the key one? And so again, what we see so often is that we're looking around for, in our very scientific thinking, the key difference, when almost nothing in our life has one key difference. It's almost always multiple factors, and many of the factors are hidden, and we're not smart enough or aware enough or don't have enough information to actually know even a combination of a half dozen or a dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozen factors that have actually contributed to creating the one specific relevance realization selected thing that we pointed to and said, now we've arrived. New York City is great because of Seinfeld, Sex and the City, and Friends.
Not answered. And the director doesn't know. And the writer doesn't know. And this is the problem. So in the Nolan films, to take the contrast, the question as to why Batman does this is because if Batman does not actually intimidate the criminal underworld because the city is so corrupt, no one else will do it, and money isn't going to solve the problem. And so,
even in just these few little clips that he played, you've got sunlight, you've got airplanes, you've got clean, you've got Batman looking dapper and Alfred looking establishment. Now, Alfred in the Batman movie is, what movie was that? I think it might have been The Winter Soldier. The Alfred in the Batman movie is played by an actor who was it Andy Serkis? Who was basically an arms dealer, I think, in The Winter Soldier. And so you've almost got the sense that, and this comes through later in the film, that when Papa Wayne is killed, Alfred takes it as his responsibility. You almost get the sense that, the butler aspect is sort of a, not an important thing. You seem to have a woman in the house who's answering the phone and doing a lot of the menial chores, although Alfred gets to open the mail, which will become a plot point as the movie goes on. But you almost get the sense that Alfred himself is a brawler, and in some ways looks tougher than Bruce Wayne or the Batman does. But even so, just look at the car of the Christopher Nolan's Batman movies. The car is this muscular, huge wheels. It's a Hummer without the body on it, and the car, the Batmobile in the Batman movie will be, again, something that it looks like a wealthy man tinkered with in his own basement. He doesn't have the surprising Mr. Fox to deliver to him all of these technological wonders that no one would ever have time to construct all by themselves. Whereas I think part of the virtue of the Batman movie is that he seems to be a tinkerer, and it's sort of Batman on a depressed man's budget.
he needs to create a theatrical kind of fear in order to dissuade the criminal underworld from participating. And then, as it turns out, he also has to save the city itself and demonstrate his faith in the city by becoming a symbol. Here, you don't really know.
And I think that's,
why Batman is doing what he's doing. It's never explained. He's very wealthy.
And that's true. I think a ton of what Ben Shapiro points out here is really insightful and correct. This Batman doesn't quite know what he's doing. Now, look at Tim Keller's conversation about the difference between Tolkien's book and the Lord of the Rings movie. Aragorn isn't really sure of what he's doing in the movie. He knows exactly what he's doing in the book. Why the difference? Well, now we see a continued evolution of, it's on the hierarchy, uncertainty about one's individual mission is a plus. And so here what we have in this Batman movie is the most emo Batman around. He's sullen, he's depressed, he's working out of anger. He's not clear-eyed. He doesn't have a mission. He doesn't even have a mission that a clear-eyed person is sort of grappling with. He's just sort of emotively feeling his way through, with a few exceptions in the movie. And I think this change of assumption is noteworthy in terms of our assumptions about what a leader, what a model individual should look like in the world.
He doesn't apparently do anything with his wealth. He doesn't try to give charity. He doesn't try, this is actually made a plot point. He's a bad man because he's white. He's a bad white man who doesn't actually give charity. He's not involved, and he's not playing that as a role. Again, this is part of the problem, is that Bruce Wayne and Batman are the same character. So if you...
And this, again, is to a degree sort of a deconstruction of the Wasp. A woke a woke takedown of the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And again, in past Batman movies, Bruce Wayne had the Wayne Foundation, and orphans could be taken care of, and you just had the sense that he was sort of the model man in that on his bright side he was the waspy philanthropist, but his shadow, he was out there doing the dirty work. And this is sort of what we want. And this is key to American image, because on one hand, we have the Peace Corps and we give foreign aid and we do all these things. So that's the Bruce Wayne face of America. But the other face of America is, but if you cross us, we can bloody you worse than any other nation in the world. And that's sort of the right fist and the left fist.
I keep using the Nolan comparison because it is the gold standard for all superhero movies, not just Batman movies. So when you look at Nolan's Batman, Bruce Wayne is the character that Batman is playing. Okay, Bruce Wayne is not real. Batman is real. Batman is who Bruce Wayne really is. And
right there. So is Batman one side of Bruce Wayne? Or is Batman the real Bruce Wayne? And I think here we see something in Ben Shapiro.
He has to play a fop. In Batman Begins, he's squiring around ladies in his Lamborghini, and he's buying hotels, and he's doing all of this just to cover up for the fact that he is Batman. So you get very separate Batman.
And I think Shapiro is right in terms of the Christopher Nolan movie. And what you tend to see in the Batman movie is a Batman. Well, he'll make this point. It's the same guy, but in Christopher Nolan movie, this Batman is just playing a role in public. And you don't see that in other Batman movies. In other Batman movies, again, they're sort of, the right fist of violence, but the left fist of feminine benevolence.
Batman and Bruce Wayne. You get the same thing actually with Michael Keaton. Batman and Bruce Wayne are two different characters. Here, Batman and Bruce Wayne are the exact same character. There are points where Bruce Wayne is walking around. He's got the same dour expression, same glazed look, same kind of emo thing going on as Batman.
And I'll tell you, this is the most email Batman by far. I mean, the Christopher Nolan Batman could sometimes be brooding and insecure, and he's trying to grope his way into the future, but this dude is just depressed.
Batman does the entire movie. And so there's no dichotomy. Alrighty, folks. Well, I may not have loved the Batman winning from fours. They gets in your life. He has that. So he's not really good at Batmaning yet. And he is tracking down criminals, and he gets drawn into a plot by the Riddler. The Riddler is giving clues.
Okay, so again, you begin this movie with questions of sort of levels of analysis. How do you make the city better? Here's the question. How does one person make a city better? Because the question is, well, one city is too much for one person. And now we're sort of getting into the Plato's Republic, Jonathan Peugeot. It's so interesting that both Plato and Peugeot basically say, well, you can understand principalities and powers if you look at the relationship between an individual or a person and a city and understand the relation between the two.
So that Batman can track down all the way through the system of Gotham this citywide corruption that apparently is going to bring down the entire superstructure of faith in the city. Meanwhile,
okay, so basically the city is corrupt. And so when you get the Catwoman speech, she just had this tiny little white speech, which was exactly the woke credo. It was the Apostles' Creed of Wokism. She just put it right there in the movie. The entire city is corrupt. And the mob bosses and the political establishment are exactly the same. And the black woman running for mayor, her name is Bella Real. Which is like, wow, you really wanted us to get that message. But now, there is by no means any certainty that this woman is going to make a difference. Now, there's all sorts of weird. The end of the movie does really fall apart in some ways. I mean, it fell apart so dramatically that at one point my wife leaned over to me, just got my eyes just so she could make sure that I could see her roll them at the place in the movie, which Shapiro will get to, where the Batman is leading out the people with this flare through the water, and he sort of becomes Doctors Without Borders. And so again, I think Shapiro's review of this is spot on in many, many ways, but I think, again, the larger question of the movie is that this is in many ways a deconstruction of wokeism, which is probably a la Peugeot returning to a new establishmentarianism.
Well, you have Catwoman, who's Selena Kyle, played by Zoe Kravitz. And Zoe Kravitz is similarly engaged in an attempt to commit a robbery against one of these underworld figures, but she's drawn into Batman's orbit by a murder that both of them are investigating at the same time, the murder of her roommate, maybe something more going on there. The Riddler is the main villain of the movie. You see the Penguin a fair bit. Carmine Falcone is one of the big characters in the movie. You get a little bit of Alfred. Of course, you get Jim Gordon, whose main job in this film is apparently just to say Jesus over and over again.
Christ. Which I didn't notice, but fair enough.
It's Coulson.
Whenever something bad happens, he just goes, Jesus. And that happens like 6 times. Like, Jim Gordon does nothing except for basically stop Batman from getting arrested a lot.
Shapiro's right.
That's pretty much all he does. He's a bad detective. He doesn't do anything. The plot is that all these people get killed. Batman uncovers it. He realizes that his dad was corrupt also, or that his dad engaged in corruption with Carmine.
And now that's a key part of the film. Because, again, if you're going to deconstruct something, effectively, you have to represent it at least fairly in terms of what it says. And part of the film, as Shapiro noticed, that, all white men have lots of power and they are corrupt. And the only good white man in the movie is Batman. Now Papa Wayne, his character is sort of redeemed a little bit, that, well, you can't trust Falcone in terms of telling us what Senior Wayne really thought and did, and Alfred sort of restores Bruce Wayne's faith in his father. There's as with all of the Batman movies, but there's so many daddy issues in this movie. There's so many daddy issues in this movie because, of course, the two main characters' fathers are, depending on how you understand Thomas Wayne and Falcone, or Falcone, the sins of the father. No more lies. And so the Riddler is, again, sort of the counterpart, and Shapiro will get into this, of who Batman is. And so this is a question of, in some ways, are white men redeemable?
Carmine Falcone. Finally, we get to the end. Paul Dano does it's such a ripoff of Seven. He gives himself up. He doesn't get captured by Batman. Batman does not prevent a single one of these deaths. Batman, in fact, is complicit in one of the deaths by accident. And he doesn't actually capture the Riddler because he's clever. The Riddler gives himself up by sitting at a diner and getting arrested. Then he unleashes a bombing of Gotham that essentially causes the flooding of the city. And Batman goes to the Madison Square Garden, where
Now the flooding of the city is clearly, come on, Ben. The symbolism is all over the place in this movie. The flooding of the city is clearly a purging by water. It's a cleansing. It's a washing away of the sins of the city.
Mayoral event is now being held for the brand new mayor, who is an uplifting black female who has no other story or backstory, so she's really uninteresting. It starts to flood. And up on top, in the wings, are a bunch of Paul Dano's followers, are a bunch of the Riddler's followers who are all dressed like the Riddler, and they are shooting down.
And now, again, this film was filmed during COVID, and so masks are a big part of this film. Batman, of course, wears a mask. As the Critical Drinker in his review noted, the police had ample opportunity to take off Batman's mask when he was unconscious in a particular scene, yet later they think about taking off his mask. The Riddler, we see both masked and unmasked, and there's a lot of 2 levels of identity things going on in here. Okay.
Into the crowd to try and kill members of the elite in Gotham City. And so Batman goes up there and he's beating people up. There comes a point where he's beating this guy and he's really like maybe beating him almost to death. And he stops and they take off that guy's mask and they say, "Who are you?" And the guy says, "I am vengeance." Okay, now this is the theme throughout the film. Ooh, the theme. Okay, so in order to explain why this is a problem, you have to now understand the character of the Riddler. So it says right at the beginning of the movie, "Who is Batman? I'm vengeance," right? He's just on the streets and he's beating people up.
I'm vengeance.
And then
Okay, now, again, at the beginning of the movie, the question is, well, how can you clean up a city? Well, how do we know the corruption of the city? Because of Kitty Genovese. And Rorschach, of course, well, he's sort of one side of Batman. All right. So Batman starts the movie, he's just beating up everybody on the streets. But Batman has a crisis and says, I've been doing this for 2 years and it doesn't seem to help. Well, okay. How do you clean up a city? And the question is, what is the source of the corruption? Now, an S word will come to mind, spiritual. Where is the spirit of the city? And how can the spirit of the city be controlled? Can it be controlled by the Bella Real mayor? See, the mayor before was corrupt and the mayor is murdered it's really the opening sequence of the movie where the mayor who is running for re-election gets murdered. Or can the city be cleaned up from the ground up? Is it going to be the broken windows policy? Or is it going to be, rooting out the corruption so we have these pure people at the top?
And people keep calling him Mr. Vengeance for no apparent reason. Like, we don't know why they're calling him that because he never actually publicly says he's vengeance. It's in his creepy...
And the question is, what is he taking revenge for? Now, he's certainly in the shadows, and the whole idea is that he's striking fear in the hearts. Well, we're going to use fear. We're going to scare people straight. We're going to use fear, and that's what's going to keep these bad things from happening. But vengeance implies that you have been wronged, and you're simply taking the law into your own hands. That's what a vigilante does. But someone who's a billionaire who cares for the city, which he obviously does, and doesn't want to abandon his charge. At one point, Bruce Wayne walks to go to the funeral of the mayor, and Falcone looks at him and says to his cronies, "Oh, look, the prince of the city." That's Bruce Wayne. He's the prince of the city. Now, if the city is a principality, the city is about as depressed as emo Bruce Wayne is. So there's a lot going on there.
Diary, which again is supposed to be a mirror image. Calling him Mr. Vengeance for no apparent reason. Like, we don't know why they're calling him that because he never actually publicly says he's vengeance. It's in his creepy diary, which again is supposed to be a mirror image of the fact that the Riddler also keeps a Zodiac Killer style diary. So they're supposed to be two halves of the same whole. Batman is beating up this follower of the Riddler's. He takes off his mask and the guy says, "I'm vengeance." And suddenly Batman realizes he can't be vengeance. That's not what he's meant to do. He's betrayed his mission.
And again, by Shapiro's voice, Shapiro sort of mocks this. But that is, in fact, a key moment of the movie. Now, what Shapiro is mocking is sort of where this movie then goes with this, which is in some ways an imagined reconstruction of it, but Alexander Dugin would look at it and say, "No, that's not the Great Reset. You're just doing what you've always done." And Dugin and Shapiro have a real point here.
And so he then descends on an electrified cable because he's trying to stop people from being electrocuted by...
And this is where the movie just makes no sense at all, because Batman wants to keep a large air conditioning unit from falling into the water that will somehow electrocute all of the people in the water. And so what he does is he gets on the cord and he cuts it and he goes down with the cord, and it's like, didn't you just bring the cord of electricity into the water? And then of course he survives that. He pops up from it after his baptism.
Had this flying electrical wire, and he cuts off the cable. He's holding on to it. He falls down into the water. A rebaptism. He gets up, and then he proceeds to lead a bunch of people who are not really trapped, but kind of trapped, I suppose. And he leads them to, I guess, a safer place by carrying a torch.
and it's right there. Let's see if I can. And it's right here that my wife just turns to me and looks and rolls her eyes and says, "Oh gosh, really?" And hey, Alexander Dugin has this one right. He doesn't comment on this movie, but this new reconstruction is exactly the same as the old. We have waspy Bruce Wayne leading the people to safety. And it's quite amazing. After he descends from on high and is baptized into the water as new Jesus Batman, he goes over and he pushes something aside, and you have the little boy that he's been identifying with the whole movie, because this is the boy, the son of the corrupt mayor who has been killed, and he rescues him first, and then he rescues the black mayor, the black woman mayor. But the whole thing is sort of muddled, because wasn't she shot? I mean, that was the whole purpose of the guys up there with the sniper rifles. She was their first target. They were supposed to kill her, and so on and so forth. But Commissioner Gordon tries to save her. The whole thing just really sort of falls apart at this point and becomes this. Now again, here the color scheme, it's exactly like Ben Shapiro's. Maybe he's doing that intentionally, I don't know. But and now suddenly he leads them out.
Place by carrying a torch. And then he goes up to the top of Madison Square Garden, and he is helping people be airlifted and medevaced out. And this is how he has learned fulfillment. So what is this movie about? This movie is about how fighting criminality does not actually help innocent people. He says this at the very beginning. He says, I'm not sure I'm doing any good. By fighting the criminals, crime is still up. It turns out that Batman has to stop being Batman. Batman has been missing it the whole time. What Batman really has to be is Superman. Batman needs to go into areas like Madison Square Garden and not fight the criminals. He needs to go and lead people with a torch to a slightly safer area. He needs to help medevac people on the top of he needs to build Habitat for Humanity. He needs to join Jimmy Carter and build houses for homeless people.
Right. Batman needs to be Doctors Without Borders. That's who Batman needs to be.
That's what Batman needs to be doing. This really is a sort of attack on the idea that fighting crime helps innocent people. It's an almost defund the police attitude toward what crime is. And
see, now, I don't get that out of this movie. I think actually this movie is about the deconstruction of wokeism. The reconstruction isn't much different from what they are deconstructing, but what they're trying to save are institutions. Okay? Now, let's see if he goes all the way to the end.
And it's an attack on the basic idea that individuals are capable of doing justice by finding bad guys and fighting them. Instead, apparently, individuals are only capable of doing nice things.
Now again, this is a guy who basically does political commentary from a particular point of view. And he's not a district attorney. He is Ben Shapiro is trying to engage public dialogue at a fairly high level in order to try to address the principality. He's not Crime Stoppers. We have Crime Stoppers. Have you ever watched Crime Stoppers? I mean, Crime Stoppers, in a sense, what Ben Shapiro is saying is Batman should stick to Crime Stoppers. Okay? Don't. You're deconstructing Batman. You hate Batman.
And it's an attack on the basic idea that individuals are capable of doing justice by finding bad guys and fighting them. Instead, apparently, individuals are only capable of doing nice things by helping little old ladies cross the street. It's this sort of mentality that has led to New York turning into Gotham City in the last couple of years, by the way. That's a fundamental betrayal of what Batman is. What makes Batman different from the Riddler and than any of these other criminals is these criminals target innocent people and Batman targets criminals. That's the basis of the character. The entire basis of the character is the cops are bad at targeting criminals because they're corrupt. Batman is good at targeting criminals because he's smart and because he's rich and because he's incorruptible.
Ben Shapiro is Batman. Except he isn't. He's not doing Crime Stoppers.
That's the entire basis of Batman. And they take all that and they flip it on its head because they don't like Batman. And this is why I have real problems with the movie. I kind of hate the movie. Like, the more I think about it, the more I get angry at it.
So that's Ben Shapiro on it. And that was, and I think, he sees a lot. I think he sees a lot right. But I think there are deeper questions in the movie than just, whether or not the district attorney should charge shoplifters. I think that question is being resolved pretty quickly now. As to the surprise of no one, the answer is, if you just let petty crime go, you'll have bigger crimes later. Okay, now Chris Stuckman, who does movie reviews.
Most of you have gotten the chance to see it. It's really good. I love this movie so much the more I think about it. And the second time that I saw it this weekend, I loved it even more. So I hope you guys have a good time.
So again, whether you love, consciousness is monofocal. You saw the Batman movie, and first the lowest resolution possible, up or down. Okay, well, what does that mean? Do I watch? There are movies I remember seeing Birds of Prey. I walked out of that movie saying, boy, there's 2 hours. It's really gone in my life. There's nothing redeeming about that movie. I found redeeming things in the Batman movie because I think it says something about where the zeitgeist is at via the mythology of a standard character. You can sort of read the spirits moving around in the culture. So then I think looking at a negative review and the positive review, we can see something about this.
Loved the idea that we...
Now already you can tell we had Ben Shapiro just red and black in the studio, and I hated it. And there's a Ben Shapiro. Why does Ben Shapiro love Batman? Because he wants to be Batman, because he wants to be as rich as Bruce Wayne. And part of Ben Shapiro really does want to go out into the dark of the night in Los Angeles that he left and clean up the streets with his fists. That's a part of Ben Shapiro, I would think. I wouldn't be surprised with that at all. Now, this guy, we've got, well, what is he? Just look at his set. Well, he's a movie fan. He's got a PlayStation. He's like, I'm a big kid. I still have dolls back there. Well, so do I. I got Kermit's legs here. And I have all these movies. This is my credential, and I loved it. Well, what do you mean you loved it? We'll hear what he means by it.
We open on Halloween, and obviously we're going into the long Halloween comic, which is amazing, but we see criminals looking into dark alleyways and the shadows of Gotham streets. And even though Batman's not there, they're beginning to think he might be. He could be hiding in the shadows. And even Pattinson is like, I am the shadows. I was like, oh, fuck. This is good. But eventually Batman does show up in one of these dark, shadowy alleyways. And like I said in my spoiler-free review, the idea of hearing his footsteps long before he appears and just having him slowly come out of the shadows in a gorgeous fucking wide shot gave me tingles across my entire body. It was like Batman ASMR. I just felt tingles.
So again, levels of analysis. The movie begins sort of at this personal level of, here's this guy, and he's about to get beat up by this gang. And I just had sort of flashback to the movie from the 70s, The Warriors. Warriors, come out and play. This movie about basically, gangland violence in the streets of New York in the 1970s. And so, what is a city? And how can it be redeemed? And how can its spirit change? Because that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the salvation of the spirit of a city.
And I fell in love with the way this movie looks. Matt Reeves' direction along with Greg Fraser's cinematography. It's the best looking Batman film that's ever existed. I'm a big fan of the Nolan trilogy, and Mask of the Phantasm I think is a legitimate masterpiece. But this movie just is on another level. Just about every shot in the movie has a staggering amount of production value put into it. And when you remember all of the difficulties they had shooting this film when it came to COVID, Pattinson got COVID, all the lockdowns and everything. Supposedly he was even directing them through an earpiece and wasn't even near, which is a testament to Matt Reeves as a filmmaker. ever addressed the fact that Batman straight up wears black eye makeup around his eyes underneath his mask. And Batman...
Now, this is something that I hadn't thought of, and so I appreciated it from this. But yeah, and the wearing black eye makeup all the time just accentuates the Pattinson emo vibe. It's like, we need someone who can play Batman and have one emotion. Gray. Let's get him. Sparkly vampire no more.
Returns, you can actually see where they pretend like it doesn't exist. You have Keaton as Batman here with his eye makeup. When they cut back to him, it's gone because he's going to rip off his mask and it would look weird, right? Not really. I think it helps. It adds a lot. I loved seeing him in the club, like when he would take off his cowl and have to infiltrate the club. He still had that eye makeup on. It's not going to go away. I just love that this film was so obsessed with being grounded that even...
Right there. It's so obsessed with being grounded. Well, what's he saying? Well, he's not Ben Shapiro in his black and red studio being like, he undercut my character and my fantasy about going out at night and beating wrongdoers to a pulp. That's Batman. You've corrupted Batman. No, I like this Batman. This Batman was great. It was so grounded. What do you mean by grounded? Why did you use that word? It's almost like he's in my Sunday school class. Why did you mean, why grounded? Well, maybe we have a sense that the times are dark. And we have a sense that people are corrupt. And the institutions are not functioning.
Even those aspects that even Nolan's incredibly realistic trilogy ignored, this film...
Incredibly realistic trilogy. That is a funny word to use for these kinds of movies. What do you mean realistic? I think he means that it feels like it is expressing the spiritual temper of the age. And this is, when you look at religion, when I Lucy just told me that she was giving me permission to release our conversation, which I'm really excited for because it was a really good conversation. Part of what religion is for is it puts you within a conversation that has enough established variables and ancient enough conversation partners, family members, as it were, that you can do sense making over a very long period of time. And a story like Batman, because it's so established, and because it keeps getting reiterated, has a degree of that quality to it. You can understand something about the times going back and watching all the old Batman movies. Now, of course, it's not scientific, but you get a sense of the times by the movies, because movies are both forming but are also telling of the time and the people that are producing them. Realistic? You mean the movie feels like the spirit of the age? Yeah, I really should pull out Pilgrim's Regress and treat Lewis's treatment of the spirit of the age. I think it's genius in that book.
Is saying, yep, he's going to have makeup all over his eyes. That's just the way it is. Something else about that club sequence that I loved is the three ways in which Batman attempts to infiltrate this club.
Now, this gets to the point that Shapiro was making. That Shapiro wants one integrated Batman who is really the Batman and not Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne is the cover story. This Batman is more integrated and therefore much, much closer to each other. Emo Batman, mask or no mask. Black eye makeup stays on the whole time. And what this guy gets in terms of the three scenes in which Batman/Bruce Wayne gets into the club takes three different modes, but it's the same person. In other words, the tighter integration of the character of the person of Batman and Bruce Wayne in this movie as opposed to the others. And again, Shapiro didn't like it. This guy, well, I don't think this guy is thinking at the same level as Ben Shapiro. Sorry.
First time he shows up and he's Batman and he's like, "Do you know who I am?" And they're like, "Yeah, man, I don't give a shit." And he has to beat them up to get in. The second time he shows up as Bruce Wayne and he's like, do you know who I am?" "Holy shit, you're Bruce Wayne. Yeah, go ahead." The third time, he just fucking sneaks in. He's like, "Fuck you guys, I'm done with you. I'm just going to sneak in behind you." I also loved how Batman and the cops were very much so at odds. This has been explored in other films. Gordon has...
And of course, you know, the cops are at odds, the cops are corrupt, and, well, after George Floyd, we just had sort of a national conversation on policing, and that conversation continues, but of course, with all sorts of other things through COVID, it sort of swung the other way, and nobody's talking about defunding police now. The only question is that money only gets you so far. If you want, you can pull this out of my adult Sunday school class, what is the difference between a good cop and a corrupt cop? Dikaiosune, righteousness. Dallas Willard in The Divine Conspiracy tries to get at what we mean by that word. It's the thing inside of us. See, inside, secret, sacred self. Or it's the spirit that takes over us. Is it a spirit of righteousness whereby the police officer sacrificially does what he needs to do in order to save the world? Think, of course, men in Ukraine. Men. You know, Bill Maher had some pretty clear things to say about why suddenly is the gender binary okay in Ukraine but not okay in America? The women and children flee the country and the men stay and fight.
Has always kind of been the savior for Batman in regards to the police officers, and he's trying to say, like, look, I know he's a vigilante, but he's trying to help. But when it comes to this movie in particular, you can tell that the cops are actually upset with Batman. Like, they don't even want him to be at the crime scene. They're like, "What are you doing, Gordon?" You're like, "What is this guy doing here? He's a fucking vigilante." You know, they're very upset with his involvement, leading to a great scene later where Batman is captured by the police after one of the Riddler's bombs goes off and kills Peter Sarsgaard, which was a fucking riveting sequence, by the way. And we get Batman in a holding cell with a crowd of cops who want to beat the shit out of him. And I loved that scene. It was fucking great. But that reminds me.
Okay. Kills Peter Sarsgaard. Well, I thought it killed the district attorney. No, it kills Peter Sarsgaard. Well, who's Peter Sarsgaard? Is Peter Sarsgaard in the Batman universe? He is now. Well, what do you mean? Isn't it funny how we pay attention to the actors? And paying attention to the actors, what we're really trying to do is sort of integrate these movies into our world. And we look at this one world and we look at our world and we're sort of A/B testing. We're sort of doing our dead reckoning analysis. And we're trying to figure out, we're doing sense making through a movie like this. That's what movies are for. That's what art is for. We're doing sense making through it.
The Riddler's different puzzles, I really thought they were a lot of fun. They had a perfect amount of humor, like when Batman picks up this little, the true over-the-top version of this character. But obviously,
okay, now here's another past Batman. This one with, just notice the difference in the age.
Jim Carrey as the Riddler is like the true over-the-top version of this character, but Paul Dano definitely retains some of that humor in the writing, especially like URL and scenes like that, where you have people trying to figure out these riddles like Gordon and Batman, who are very smart characters, and they go through all these really complicated things to get to URL, and they're like, of course. And that's kind of hilarious. The Riddler is essentially saying, I just fucked.
Okay, so obviously the Riddler, now, why is he wearing green? Is he an eco-terrorist? We go back to First Reformed and ask questions about that. No More Lies. The Riddler is also a masked crusader who wants to clean up the city. And so, of course, he's going to blow the seawall so that nature rushes in and cleanses the city from unrighteousness. He's sort of a John Brown character. You're only going to redeem the city in blood. And they're all corrupt, including Thomas Wayne. And so, of course, Bruce Wayne's going to have to come to terms with the legacy of his father. I thought the Riddler character was chilling and chillingly good.
With you guys so much. I made you think so hard and serious about this thing. And if you had just thought about it phonetically, you would have got it right a long time ago.
Now, the Riddler also is, of course, as Ben Shapiro noted, the opposite of Batman. Batman is a product of wealth and privilege. He's Bruce Wayne, Thomas Wayne's son. He's not really an orphan. At the end of the movie, Batman and the unmasked Riddler have a conversation. And there's a lot of tension in that conversation because Batman keeps thinking that the Riddler has figured out that he's really Bruce Wayne. And so, yeah, it might be over, but because they have to go with their masks on. But now, oh shoot, I lost my train of thought. So the unmasked Riddler says to Batman, "You're not a true orphan. You're born to privilege." And this is where, of course, Batman is sort of dark Jesus. Because he's born to privilege, but he comes down and takes the role of a bat, a night-winged creature, and tries to redeem the fallen city. There's a ton of Jesus stuff right there in that character. But the Riddler is also someone who wants to wipe the city clean with blood. They both trade in violence. And so that point in the movie that Ben Shapiro points out is really a critical point. And I think it's at that point where you see the movie as a deconstruction of wokeism, because Batman realizes, I can't just cleanse the city with blood. That's what my alter ego is doing. And now again, and I think Shapiro is right on this, the answer to that is insufficient. Well, I'm now going to be Doctors Without Borders in a funny little costume.
This thing, and if you had just thought about it phonetically, you would have got it right a long time ago. I also appreciated that this movie took something that was mostly always viewed in the films anyway as a very squeaky clean element, Bruce Wayne's parents and what happened to them. It's always, they died, they were great people, and it made him Batman. This movie was like, well, what if they kind of made like a couple mistakes and tried to hide that? They're not necessarily bad people, but they are not perfect.
Okay. This is a processing of the wokish narrative. And it's an Augustinian processing of the wokish narrative, because as B.J. Campbell noted in his conversation on the Stoa, Wokism is sort of a new version of Calvinism. But the Wokism is being deconstructed because, was Thomas Wayne really just one of those white privileged baddies? No, Alfred in the hospital says, your father was a good man who made some mistakes. Oh, whew. I guess not all white men are bad. And Batman, he's there to save the Bella Real mayor.
I really appreciated that, because it also gives Bruce Wayne a lot of conflict, because he's made this choice to do this incredible thing with his life based off of something that he is not.
To do this incredible. This is a movie reviewer who's not going too deep. Do this incredible thing with his life. Well, do this incredible thing with his life. That is even tone deaf to everything that Batman is saying about what he's doing with his life, because as Shapiro again rightly noted, he's tremendously conflicted emo guy who's just sort of going out because he feels he has to do something, and all his angstiness just leads him to do whatever he can in terms of beating up petty criminals. But of course, it has to go into, we need to save the city as a whole. But as Shapiro, I think, rightly noted, in many ways, Batman is quite impotent. He doesn't stop the murders. He doesn't catch the bad guy. About the only thing he manages to do is, be this heroic figure. It's almost back to the, which Jenner is she? I don't know. But the faded Pepsi commercial. Hold my wig, Keisha. I got some liberating to do. It's Jennifer. So Batman, and I think Shapiro's dead right at the end of the movie. The movie wants to feign like it has answers for Gotham, but then at the end of the movie also admits it really doesn't, because I don't think I played this in the Shapiro thing. I'll go back to it. Okay, more Angly Shapiro as opposed to happy Chris Stuckman.
At it, because they take the fundamental idea of what Batman is supposed to be, the protector of the innocent who targets the criminal, and they say that if he targets the criminal, this makes him no different than criminals, because Paul Dano, who's the Riddler, is also targeting criminals, all the way up until the very end, when they have to just sort of add on this attack on Madison Square Garden and New York Broad Writ for no reason. He has no motivation for blowing up a bunch of trucks and flooding downtown, like none.
No. Ben, you missed it, my friend. He is cleansing the city. A little bit of symbolic thinking. Ben Shapiro needs to watch more Jonathan Peugeot.
He doesn't explain why he does it. He doesn't explain what the purpose of it is. All the way along, he's been...
It's so obvious why he's got to clean up the city. What's the easiest symbolic way to clean up the city? You flood it. Either that or you burn it, a la Sodom and Gomorrah.
Saying, I'm exposing the true face of Gotham. Okay, that's a rationale. But what does that have to do with blowing up the city? They add that on just so that they can create a false distinction between Batman and the Riddler so that Batman can change his mission. So now Batman...
Yes, I'll agree with that. They have to. It's not. They're showing that Batman and the Riddler are in some ways the same guy. But Batman comes from privilege. It's a reiteration of it's deconstruction of wokeness back to waspness. And I think that's I think that when you look at the Peugeotian phrase, the Peugeotian turn, I think that's probably where we're going to go to. You're going to go back to sort of an establishment Protestant attempt to, because we need institutions in order to redeem the principality. The individual beating up people on the streets can only get so far. You've got to go all the way.
Batman's mission is not beating up bad guys and stopping bad guys. Now Batman's mission is to be a firefighter. He's no longer a detective or a police officer. He's a firefighter. That's a betrayal, and it's a real problem. And that's my biggest issue with the film. It just feels like such a sellout. It feels like such a sellout of what Batman is supposed to be. Again, it's got a little bit of...
You almost got little Ben Shapiro. You sold out my Batman!
Woke politics, but that's really not the problem. The problem is the broader woke orientation of the film. If the Nolan Batman was about the idea that you help innocent people by fighting criminality and provide an inspiration to people to fight criminality, if that's the idea of Batman, which it is, that's completely thrown on its head here. Matt Reeves,
which it is,
who's credited as both a director and a writer on the film, he does not like Batman, and I can't get over this. How do you give $150 million to a dude to make a movie about Batman when he clearly does not like Batman? When he thinks that Batman is bad, and that Batman has to be shown the error of his ways.
Black, white, black, red, black, red.
And learn to be a nicer human being. By the way, at the very end of the movie, Catwoman, who at no point has actually demonstrated any sort of moral bona fides. Like, I'm not sure she does a moral thing in the entire movie. At the very end, she says to him, why don't you run away with me? And we'll go rob some hedge fund CEOs. And he doesn't say back to her, that's bad to rob hedge fund CEOs.
That's what bad. This is almost the the moral nuance of a sixth grader.
Instead, he thinks about it for a moment. She's like, no, you belong in Gotham. The generalized.
And that scene right there, I think, basically shows a deconstruction of the wokeness, sort of an attempted reconstruction of waspiness, but a despair about the ability to save the future, which is pervasive in contemporary art. That Gotham cannot be saved. The best you can do is be the waspy Bruce Wayne to try to do something with the city. Maybe Bella Real will be a better administration. Maybe Lieutenant Gordon will become Commissioner Gordon. You know, you're going to have a sequel. But again, it's unlike sort of Superman and Marvel. Marvel got galactic. Superman is usually global. Batman is usually city. Okay? And the tools in each case are sort of appropriate to the particular level of arena that the story and the genre is dealing with. Now, this Watchmen Explained video is really terrific. Over 3 million views on this, and whereas I'm tempted to go through and play the whole 17 minutes. Just please, do my own Rod Dreher here thing. See the whole thing, because it's really good, because it nicely sort of goes through all the different sort of perspectives on salvation. Maybe I should go through it. I don't know.
So Watchmen goes deep into the psychology of the masked Avenger, and it doesn't find a cool hero like Batman. Rorschach is a gross, hypocritical, sad, broken man. But Rorschach does help uncover a...
And the Batman doesn't go that deep, okay? Bruce Wayne isn't finally a gross, hypocritical, sad man. And there are other Batmans along the way. Dr. Manhattan is sort of Superman come down to Earth. But can he in fact care for people? His level of analysis is way too high. Dan, our Night Owl, is so clearly another aspect of Batman who begins the story. He's overweight. He's disenchanted. Rorschach comes and says, you got to get back in the game. There's a conspiracy, but no, he's impotent. But he basically takes Dr. Manhattan's girlfriend and can't perform in bed. But then they get all excited, dressing up and going out there to save the world, dressing up and going out to the protest and reenacting the 1960s activism, which is sort of this is how the world can be saved, because that's the last time we sort of felt a credible world salvation narrative work, where we had civil rights legislation and Jim Crow ended and black folks could live where they wanted to, et cetera, and then suddenly, things can get better again. And so he has a pretty good narrative arc. Laurie's narrative arc isn't so great. Ozymandias, of course, is sort of the imperial view, and he's the smartest man in the world, and he sets up this whole thing to stop nuclear war. And yeah, that squid is awful Freudian. But in the end, he sort of gets away with it, and everybody knows he gets away with it. And the comic book about pirates of all things sort of discloses the truth. It's sort of like in Moulin Rouge, the sitar player, the magical sitar player keeps telling the truth. I only tell the truth. I only tell the truth. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Moulin Rouge, that movie. It was a great movie. And of course, Ozymandias says, well, is that Jesus? But then in the end, the movie, well, it's entirely in your hands. There are all these different salvation narratives. Is it Dr. Manhattan, this great world saver, or in the end, do you get down to the Owl and Silk Spectre, who sort of take the great American escape by being happily married and don't worry about the world and just have a good life from 0 to 80, and that's all anyone can ask for. So the movie asks deep questions. Not the movie. The movie, the uncut version of the movie is quite good, but the comic book asks deep questions. Now I want to go back to this nerd writer video about how Marvel Man changed superheroes, and I've played this one before. And he goes through some of the history of Marvel Man as sort of a Superman ripoff, and then there's lawsuits, and goes to England and sort of has that, but then the embargo against better American comics.
A new writer. Almost 20 years later, in 1982, Des Skinn decided to revive Marvel Man for his new comics anthology, Warrior, and settled on a young writer named Alan Moore to do it. What resulted changed superhero comics and superheroes forever. This is Alan Moore's Marvel Man. You can tell from the first few pages that this Marvel Man is radically different from his previous incarnation.
Okay, now he's dark. Now we're realistic, as Chris Stuckman would say.
Mickey Moran is no longer a child. He's a disheveled man of middle age, still a reporter, but financially insecure. And most importantly, he has no memory of ever being a superhero.
Okay, so now we're getting into two levels again, but in some ways the wokism is, well, you're a racist and you don't know it. Just like you're a superhero and you don't know it, or you're a monster and you don't know it.
Though he is having some strange dreams. At a hijacking a few panels later, Moran discovers the triggering word, Kitoma, and explodes into Marvel Man. Suddenly remembering the history of his heroic exploits, he flies home to tell his wife who he really is, and she laughs in his face. She points out that his backstory, essentially the basis of all superheroes, where he and his friends fight colorful villains on a regular basis, is ridiculous. And if it is true, how come nobody remembers it?
Your superhero stuff is ridiculous, honey. You're really going to lurk around in shadows and intercept random street violence? That's how the world gets saved? If we have one less murder in the city, that's how the world gets saved? But now, wait a minute. What is the world? Is it first personal? Or is it third personal? I can never get this right with my little thing here. First, well, if it's your life, if Kitty Genevieve is Genovese is your grandmother, if she's on your block, if the last mass shooting happens in your city, well, that's different. Because one is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. But what if you're the one? So these questions lurk. How can the world be saved? Well, what is the world? Is the world personalism? Does the world start with me, the first personal? Or is the world this mental picture, as C.S. Lewis has in Miracles, of Euston Station, where we basically have to use symbols to sort of represent the world to figure this out?
And if it is true, how come nobody remembers it? Moore reveals that the entire history of Marvel Man is a lie. He and his super friends were actually created in a lab with alien technology by a scientist who was a murderer and a rapist and a former Nazi, in order to give the British government a superior weapon to the atomic bomb. Their memories were dream fantasies programmed to test and control them. Why did Moore retcon the entire Marvel Man story? Well, in order to pose the question that he actually wants to explore. What if superhumans existed in the real world? Now,
what's the real world? Well, a little over $100,000 can get you a Livingstone's church. $150 million can get you a Batman movie. Which is more real?
Realism in superhero stories is something we're very familiar with today. In fact, it's something we sort of demand. We want our heroes to...
Now again, bright, all that out there. The Batman is sort of a dream.
Have flaws, emotional depth. We want our villains to be, if not sympathetic, then at least plausibly motivated. We want the actions of both to have consequences. We want that world, in other words, to resemble our own. Common as it is today, Moore was really the first to explore these ideas comprehensively, and he did it in the pages of Marvel Man. And the answers to the questions he asked were not always pretty. In fact, they were often horrifying. What Moore suggests in Marvel Man is that power changes the world irreversibly, and if great power was embodied in individuals, those beings would inevitably look on the rest of us as we look on animals.
And this, of course, is where you get the Dr. Manhattan questions in The Watchmen.
They would not be subject to our laws or even our morality. They would do as they wished, and if they wished to be cruel, their cruelty would be catastrophic.
And this gets into, of course, who is God? Because the agentic God, well, I can't believe that any God worth his salt who is all good would give us a world with this much pain. Never heard that before. These are the questions that we wrestle with, right? How can the world be saved? Which world? The first personal? The third personal? The person? The city? The nation? The globe? The cosmos? It's really in stories like this that we sort of work through this. And again, I think the Batman is working through basically a deconstruction of wokeism.
And just as we would be insects to them, they would be gods to us, incomprehensible. We will never grasp their hopes, their despair. We will never know the destiny that howls in their hearts, never know their pain, their love, their almost sexual hatred. We are only human, and perhaps we will be the less for that. It's clear that quote-unquote real superhumans wouldn't just fight crime like they do in the old comics.
They wouldn't just fight crime. Well, what is all this crime fighting about? Ben Shapiro is really upset at what they've done to Batman. No, these stories are about figuring out not only the world, but at what level of analysis the world is actually located.
It's clear that their battles would result in death and destruction. In modern comics, those things are often depicted. But after the fight is over and the havoc is wreaked, things usually go back to something approximating normal. For Moore, the presence of superheroes signifies a more fundamental change. There is no equilibrium to return to. Marvel Man doesn't switch back to Mickey Moran once his nemesis is defeated. He gives up the weak Moran forever. The superheroes work together to alter every aspect of life on Earth. They abolish money, they bring back the dead, they create new superhumans. Power like that doesn't restore balance to the world. It makes a new one.
And so this is sort of where Batman ends. The world can't be made new. What's the best we can do? Well, let's continue the WASPy project. We'll take up we'll take out the Anglo-Saxon Protestant, but we'll try to keep the institutions that have kept us in play. We'll try to hold the corruption back. It's not about street violence. It's about what's in the heart. But the morose Batman, he's just always sad. There's no great world at the end of this. You don't, in fact, just go back to Metropolis, which tends to be bright and shiny during the day, a world complete with Iowa cornfields and the goodness of Superman and Ma and Pa from back on the farm. You're left in the sad state of Gotham that, well, we'll get rid of these criminals, but there'll always be a Joker in the deck looking to wreak havoc in the future. And so I think, again, the movie is telling. And the movie tells us what it thinks and what a lot of people think and where the zeitgeist is at least for at least one of the spirits that is inhabiting us today. The theme that I often get the most encouragement to continue to follow up is the egregore spiritual theme, because we want to know what our spiritual overlords are at. And I think to a certain degree, we can see some of them as they reveal themselves in the movies. I don't know how long this was. Probably not as long. I don't know if it's long enough to satisfy you, Jacob, but here it is. So leave me a comment. Tell me what you think.